My name is Amina, and today I turn 35. The truth I carry is heavy. I am mother to 6 children, all fathered by the man who gave me life. Born in Baghdad during 1988, I entered a world already torn by war and bound by ancient religious customs. My father stood as more than a parent to me. He served as an imam, a revered spiritual guide whom our community sought for Islamic teachings and life counsel. His wisdom commanded respect, his words carrying the weight of sacred scripture. To me, he represented everything, the architect of my thoughts, the master of my choices. My earliest memories hold no space for childhood joys, no toys or playmates or innocent laughter. Instead, they overflow with rigid rules, harsh restrictions, and endless lessons he claimed came directly from Allah's commandments. Though others saw him as a man of God, to me he became master, instructor, and the singular voice that would define my existence. When I reached 6 years old, death claimed my mother, leaving a scar across my memory that time cannot heal. She had been the gentle counterbalance to his severity, a woman who rarely challenged his authority yet, whose mere presence wrapped me in safety. I can still feel her tender touch, hear her soft voice, remember how she tried shielding me from his relentless strictness. But death stole her swiftly, and I remained alone with only my father. Neighbors filled our Baghdad home with tears and condolences, bringing meals while reciting verses to comfort our loss. Being so young, I couldn't grasp what losing a mother truly meant. One day she existed beside me, the next she lay buried beneath the earth, abandoning me in a house that suddenly turned cold and hollow. After her passing, my father's control over my life intensified, as though her absence freed him to shape me without interference. Everyone anticipated he would remarry soon. Islamic tradition not only permitted but, actually encouraged men to take additional wives, especially young widowers raising small children. Throughout our neighborhood, whispers speculated about which family might provide his new bride. Some women even approached through relatives, presenting themselves as candidates, believing marriage to a respected imam brought honor. Yet he surprised everyone by refusing all offers. He declared that Allah had bestowed upon him special duties, that his life would focus entirely on teaching, worship, and raising me without distraction. People urged him to reconsider, reminding him that Islam allowed multiple marriages, but he remained unmoved before the community. His refusal painted him as a man of extraordinary discipline, someone who placed faith above personal desires. For me, though, it meant our house would never again know softness. No other woman would offer comfort or share the burden of his absolute authority. Only he and I remained, with nothing else between us. From my first words, my father instilled complete obedience within me. He taught that women existed to serve, submit, and obey without question. He frequently quoted Quranic verses claiming men held divine authority over women. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor while kneeling before him, listening as he repeated passages he insisted validated his dominion. Constantly, he reminded me that questioning him was forbidden, that accepting his every word as law represented my sole duty. Even as a small child, I felt those declarations crushing down upon me. While other Baghdad children played freely in the streets, laughing and running with friends, I remained indoors, memorizing lessons that denied me any voice of my own. My father's house knew no laughter, only silence, discipline, and countless restrictions. He governed our home with the same iron authority he wielded in the mosque. When neighbors sought his counsel, I watched them listen respectfully, nodding at his every utterance. At home, he expected identical submission from me. Any disagreement, even over trivial matters, would darken his expression and unleash his thunderous voice, declaring I had overstepped boundaries. We ate meals in complete silence, with me seated below him, waiting for his permission before touching food. Every corner of our dwelling reinforced his absolute control. Even my clothing remained under his command. He ensured I wore long garments from early childhood, constantly reminding me that modesty defined a woman's obligation. I developed believing my thoughts held no value, that my opinions constituted sin, and that obedience offered the only path to survival. Around 2000, when I turned 12, my father announced a decision that would transform our lives forever. He declared we would abandon Baghdad for a remote desert settlement far from urban life. He never clearly explained his reasoning, simply stating it was Allah's will and that questioning would represent disobedience. We gathered our few possessions, and I recall leaving behind the towering buildings, crowded streets, and familiar calls to prayer that echoed through Baghdad's mosques. The desert town we entered was quiet, isolated, and unforgiving. Our new home was a simple mud brick structure offering little comfort, surrounded by endless sand and oppressive silence. No schools existed nearby, no relatives to visit, no girls my age for conversation. My father claimed this isolation was beneficial, that I would remain uncorrupted by outside influences. In that wasteland, I discovered true loneliness, trapped in a life where only his voice reached my ears. Moving to the desert sealed my fate in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. Each day followed identical patterns: prayers led by my father, Islamic instruction, household duties, and crushing silence. He severed every possible connection to the broader world. Though he taught at the local mosque, I was forbidden to attend. When he traveled to the city, he explained that mosques served men exclusively, that women's voices had no place in public worship. The contradiction burned within me. He could stand before congregations teaching, while I, his own daughter, was denied even sitting among other women. He also prohibited me from joining Quranic classes with neighborhood girls. When I asked why, he insisted he alone was sufficient to teach me, that no one else should influence my thinking. I grew up knowing no friends, no teachers, no neighbors. My world contracted to the walls of our desert dwelling and the words of one man claiming divine authority. By my 14th birthday, I had already accepted that my life differed completely from other girls. I heard distant echoes of laughter when groups of girls passed our house, but approaching them remained forbidden. My father warned that they represented distractions, that women gathering together often fell into sin through gossip or envy. I believed him because no other reference points existed. Without schooling, I possessed no education, no books except the Quran he placed in my hands, no voice beyond what he permitted. The isolation deepened yearly, and though I sometimes felt yearning for freedom, I buried those feelings, convincing myself that obedience was the only way to please Allah. My childhood concluded not with toys or playful memories, but within a cage constructed from rules, verses, and silence. It marked the beginning of a path that would shape my entire existence. The mosque stood at our town's heart, yet for me it remained eternally closed. My father preached there regularly, instructing men about Islam, leading prayers, offering guidance. I would watch him depart in his long robes, respected by everyone around him. But those mosque doors stayed barred to me. He insisted women belonged at home, and even when other local women gathered for Quranic recitation or prayer, I was excluded. He repeatedly stated that Islam required no women's voices in public worship. He insisted my place was within the house, learning solely from him, even when I pleaded to sit quietly at the mosque's back. He refused every request. He claimed Allah's words were not for me to learn elsewhere, only for him to teach me in his chosen manner. The mosque, that center of community and learning, became another barrier separating me from the world beyond our home. His instruction filled every moment of my life. Daily he seated me and repeated that women must never rise above men. He quoted the Quran to remind me that men held higher, stronger positions by Allah's decree. I still hear his voice saying, "Amina, never forget this. The man is your master and you are his servant. This is Allah's design for the world." He told stories of women who disobeyed men and faced punishment, presenting them as warnings for me. He said if I ever attempted rising above him or any other man, I would dishonor myself and invite Allah's wrath. These lessons weren't occasional reminders, they were drilled into me daily. Gradually, I stopped imagining any different life. My thoughts of freedom or equality vanished because he convinced me they represented sins. I grew up believing my worth was measured solely by obedience quality. His use of religious verses was constant. Whenever I hesitated following his commands, he would open the Quran and recite passages he claimed granted him authority. I was too young and uneducated to question his interpretations, so I believed every word he spoke. Allah says men are guardians over women, he would remind me, insisting this meant I possessed no independent voice. He twisted every verse into rules that kept me silent. Even simple acts like eating, speaking, or walking outside were framed as obedience to him and therefore to Allah. He created connections between his authority and God's authority, so disobeying him felt like disobeying Allah himself. This fear chained me internally. I learned to obey without question, to lower my eyes when he spoke, and to accept his rule as divine law. His power wasn't merely physical, but spiritual, controlling me completely. Moments arose when I wanted to resist, but the weight of his words crushed any rebellious thoughts. When I refused tasks, he would remind me of obedient Quranic women and how Allah rewarded them. If I argued, he warned of disobedient women and their punishments. These warnings created fear so profound that even private thoughts felt dangerous. I became careful not to dream of another life, not to think of school or friends or freedom. My mind was shaped by verses he repeated, words he claimed came from Allah. Each lesson reminded me that I existed beneath him, that my life held no meaning outside his authority. The more he spoke, the smaller I became inside. My voice was disappearing, my hope shrinking, my identity dissolving. His control was total, and I felt powerless to resist. The absence of education strengthened his control even more. With no school to attend and no books to read, I had no knowledge to compare against his teachings. He controlled what I learned and how I understood the world. Sometimes I overheard street children discussing science, history, or simple school stories. I wanted to know those things too, but when I asked, he scolded me severely. He said education for women was worthless, that it would only make me disobedient. He reminded me repeatedly that Allah had already written my destiny, and it didn't involve learning beyond the Quran he provided. I realized that my ignorance was part of his power. Without education, I couldn't question him. Without knowledge, I couldn't see alternative paths. He kept me in darkness, and within that darkness, his authority became unbreakable. Friendship was another thing denied to me. Even when neighborhood women invited me to join them, my father refused. He said women together were dangerous because they spread gossip and disobedience. When I heard girls laughing outside, I longed to join them, but he warned that laughter signaled weakness. He said a woman's place was to remain silent, serious, and obedient. I began fearing even the sound of joy. My life became one of quietness, where I spoke only when addressed and smiled only with his permission. The isolation grew heavier each year. I saw other girls marry, build families, and live with some degree of freedom. But for me, even those possibilities seemed impossibly distant. My father's voice was the only one I knew, and he reminded me daily never to expect more. The silence of loneliness became my constant companion, and I accepted it as normal. The Quran remained always in his hands. When he taught about authority, he reminded me that men were leaders by Allah's decree, and women were created for service. He told stories of Prophet Muhammad's wives, emphasizing obedience and submission, ignoring any tales of kindness or love. He painted an Islamic picture that granted him total control. I sometimes wondered if there was more, but without access to other teachers or books, I had no way of knowing. His lessons always concluded with warnings. If you disobey me, you disobey Allah. These words silenced me more than anything else. They made me believe that my soul's safety depended on my father's satisfaction. I stopped thinking of myself as a person with choices. I was trained to see myself as a servant of men, and the verses he repeated became chains around my heart. My father's control extended not just over my body, but over my faith itself. When I turned 16, my father began changing the lessons he gave me. Until then, his focus had been on obedience, silence, and daily reminders that men were placed above women. But as I reached womanhood, his teachings took a darker direction. He began speaking to me about early marriage, quoting the Prophet Muhammad, and saying it was honorable for girls to marry while still young. He spoke as if this wasn't only acceptable, but a duty that would bring me closer to Allah. I remember sitting on the mat, head bowed, listening as he repeated stories of the Prophet's marriage to a young girl, presenting it as the model for every Muslim family. His voice carried authoritative weight, and his eyes demanded my agreement. I nodded, not knowing the depth of what he was preparing me for. Initially, I thought he spoke of marriage generally, that someday he would arrange a husband for me from another family. But soon his words became more personal, and the fear inside me grew. He said that a man didn't need to look outside his own household to find purity. He told me I was chosen, that Allah had placed me under his care not only as a daughter, but also as the woman who would secure him a special place in heaven. His arguments were wrapped in verses, his tone unshakable, and my silence became my prison. When I hesitated, he grew angry, quoting the Quran as if it were a weapon to break my resistance. I was trapped between fear of him and fear of Allah, unable to separate the two because he had taught me throughout my life that disobeying him meant disobeying God. The first time he touched me, I felt my voice leave me completely. He called it marriage even though no ceremony took place. He said it was Allah's will and that I should accept it with gratitude. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The desert surrounded us, and his control over my life was absolute. He reminded me that women who disobeyed men would suffer punishment, both in this life and the next. He said my obedience would guarantee me paradise. The weight of those words crushed me, silencing any protest I might have had. From that moment, I learned to live without speaking, to move through each day like a shadow in my own body. What was happening to me was framed as religion, and I was too young and too controlled to see it as anything else. My isolation became even deeper during those years. I was not only cut off from school, friends, and the mosque, but now also from the possibility of sharing my pain with anyone. There was no one to listen, no one to tell me this was wrong. My father's voice was the only one I heard, and it filled my ears with verses twisted into chains. Even my prayers felt meaningless because I no longer knew if Allah was listening or if He only heard through my father. I learned to carry my silence like a burden, never crying too loud, never asking questions, never daring to hope for escape. My world was reduced to four walls, endless lessons about obedience, and the weight of a secret I was forced to carry alone. By the time I was 18, I had given birth to my first child. I was still a girl myself, barely able to understand motherhood. But my father treated it as a natural step. He said I was blessed that Allah had opened my womb and that each child I bore was a sign of His favor. I held my baby in my arms, filled with both love and sorrow. I wanted to protect my child from the silence that had trapped me. But I had no voice, even for myself. My father claimed ownership over the baby just as he did over me. He made decisions about feeding, sleeping, and even naming the child, reminding me that I was only the vessel, not the authority. I became invisible even in motherhood, a servant to my father and a silent shadow to my child. The years that followed passed in a blur of pregnancies, births, and endless chores. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had 6 children, all born under my father's control. Each pregnancy weakened me, but he called it a blessing. Each child was raised under his rules, treated not as mine, but as his. I became more like a caretaker than a mother, carrying out his commands, feeding them when he ordered, and teaching them the same lessons of obedience he had drilled into me. Sometimes when I held my youngest close, I wanted to whisper that life could be different. But fear sealed my lips. My silence had become so complete that even in my thoughts, I rarely dared to dream of freedom. My life was not my own. My body, my children, and even my faith were claimed by my father in the name of Allah. The bondage of silence shaped me into someone I no longer recognized. When I looked in the small cracked mirror in our house, I saw a woman with tired eyes, a body worn down by childbirth, and a spirit broken by years of control. I no longer remembered the sound of laughter, the warmth of friendship, or the hope of education. My days were filled with survival, cooking, cleaning, caring for babies, and submitting to my father's demands. The few moments I had alone were filled with fear that he would hear my thoughts, as if even silence could betray me. I lived like a prisoner, bound not by chains but by verses and threats that silenced me more than any lock or key ever could. My childhood had ended early, and my womanhood was stolen before it even began. Life in the desert became a cycle that never changed. I woke each morning to prepare food for my children, cleaned the small rooms of our home, and watched over them as they played quietly under the hot sun. The silence of the desert matched the silence inside me. I rarely thought of the world outside anymore because my father's voice had taught me for years that there was no world for me beyond those sands. By this time, I was in my late 20s, worn down by the weight of 6 children and the burden of years under control. My neighbors kept their distance, and even when I saw women in the market on rare occasions, I felt too bound to speak freely. Each day looked the same as the last, and I believed this was the life I would carry to the grave. Until one unexpected day broke the silence. That week, my father had traveled to Iran for holy duties, something he did from time to time. He said it was his obligation to visit shrines and perform acts of devotion, and each time he left, the air in the house felt lighter. His absence gave me a small window of relief. Though I was still trapped in the desert with my children, I used those days to breathe more freely, to let the children laugh a little louder, and to walk outside without fear of his sudden anger. It was during one of those days while he was away in Iran that fate brought something into my life I could never have imagined. It was a dry afternoon, and I was tending to chores outside when I heard a sound that shook the air above our house and made my children run inside in fear. The helicopter came out of nowhere, flying low and unsteady. Its blades cut the air with a violent roar, sending sand swirling in every direction. My children clung to each other, eyes wide with terror. Moments later, the sky was split by a deafening explosion, and I felt the ground tremble beneath me. A dark column of smoke rose in the distance, not far from our home. My heart pounded as I realized something terrible had happened. I knew that American troops still remained in Iraq after the war, working with our forces and guarding against threats, but I never thought the conflict would touch the silence of our desert. Fear told me to stay inside, but another voice urged me to move. For the first time in years, courage stirred inside me, and I knew I had to see what had happened. Leaving my children inside, I pulled my headscarf tightly around me and began walking quickly toward the smoke. The desert stretched endlessly, the sun heavy on my shoulders, but my steps were driven by urgency. As I drew closer, the wreckage of the helicopter came into view, flames still rising from its broken body. Pieces of twisted metal were scattered across the sand, and the smell of burning fuel stung my nose. I stopped for a moment, frozen in shock, wondering if I had made a mistake. Then I heard a faint cry, weak but human, coming from behind a large piece of the wreck. My fear turned into determination. I ran forward and found a woman lying on the ground, blood covering her forehead, her uniform torn. She was alive. Her lips moved slightly, her eyes opening for a brief second before closing again. My hands trembled as I bent down to lift her. She was heavier than I expected, her body limp and weak from the crash, but I forced myself to pull her arm across my shoulder. Every step toward my house felt like a battle against the desert, but the thought of leaving her behind gave me strength. My heart raced with fear that someone might see me, because if the town learned I had brought an American soldier into my home, the punishment would be severe. But I kept moving, determined not to abandon her. Step by step, I dragged her across the sand, stopping to rest before continuing. The closer we came to the house, the more I felt the weight of the risk I was taking. At last, we reached the door. My children stared in shock as I carried the stranger inside, their questions silenced by the look on my face. I laid her gently on a thin mattress in one corner of the room. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. I used water to clean the blood from her forehead and tore pieces of cloth from old garments to cover her wounds. My children huddled together, whispering among themselves, their eyes filled with fear and curiosity. I told them this woman was hurt and must be kept secret, and they nodded silently. Through the night, I stayed by her side, offering her water when she stirred, whispering prayers that she might live. For years, my prayers had felt empty, nothing more than words repeated out of duty. But this time they came from my heart. I did not know if Allah would hear me, but I knew I could not let her die. In that moment, keeping her alive became the only thing that mattered. The first days were difficult. She drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering words in English that I barely understood. I gave her small amounts of water and food, watching her carefully, afraid her strength would fail. My children slowly grew used to her presence, sometimes helping me by bringing water or adjusting her blanket. They did not understand who she was, but they trusted me when I said she must be protected. Each time I looked at her face, I felt a mix of fear and courage. Fear that we would be discovered, courage that I had chosen to act on my own. For the first time in years, I lived in constant tension, knowing the danger if my father returned suddenly from Iran before she was gone. But I also felt something new stirring inside me, a quiet strength I had forgotten existed. On the fourth night, as the fire in the wreck burned out in the distance and the desert grew silent again, she opened her eyes fully and looked at me. Her gaze was weak but steady, and she whispered something softly. I leaned close, straining to hear her. With a trembling voice, she said, "Thank you." Those words pierced my heart. In all the years of serving my father, bearing children, and living in silence, no one had ever thanked me. Not once. My life had been one of giving without recognition, serving without acknowledgement. But here, from the lips of a stranger who had fallen from the sky, came words that touched a part of me I thought was dead. I gave her water, and tears filled my eyes. That night I cried quietly, not from fear, but from a deep relief I could not explain. As the days passed, she regained more strength. Her Arabic was broken and my English was poor, but we found ways to communicate through simple words and gestures. Sarah was the name she gave me, and she explained that another soldier had perished in the crash that brought her to my world. Every time I offered help, gratitude filled her voice, her eyes radiating genuine warmth. My children gradually accepted her presence, shyly extending food with cautious hands. When she smiled at them, I witnessed a tenderness completely alien to the harshness that had defined my existence. Within the walls of my modest dwelling, away from prying eyes, an unexpected connection was taking shape. For the very first time, someone looked at me not as property or servant, but as a fellow human being. Sarah's arrival illuminated the shadows of my voiceless existence. Though I couldn't fully comprehend it then, the moment that helicopter plummeted from the heavens marked the beginning of my transformation. Years had passed under strict control, trapped in silence, believing nothing would ever change in my world. Yet when I carried Sarah across those desert sands, I took my first step toward courage that would shatter the endless cycle. Everything was at stake when I chose to save her. Through that choice, I realized I still possessed agency, that my will could still guide my actions. The desert landscape remained unchanged around me. My father's oppressive influence continued to cast its shadow over my life. But something fundamental had shifted within me. Sarah's presence served as evidence that even amid the desert's silence, God, or perhaps something beyond my understanding, had not abandoned me. My journey was far from over. The days following Sarah's recovery brought more than physical healing. They introduced conversation to my silent home. Until that point, years had passed where dialogue consisted only of my father's commands and hushed words with my children. As Sarah regained her strength, she began speaking more, mixing broken Arabic with the limited English I could grasp. One morning, with desert sunlight streaming through our small window, she smiled and spoke slowly. "My name is Sarah. I come from Jordan, not America. America is where I serve, but Jordan is my homeland." Her words surprised me. Jordan lay close to Iraq, yet she seemed to inhabit an entirely different universe. I had assumed she was purely American, but learning of her Middle Eastern roots made her feel familiar, almost like a neighbor. That day, as she rested with a damp cloth cooling her forehead, she continued, "I was born into the Muslim faith. My family practiced Islam. We observed prayers, fasting, everything required." She hesitated, searching for the right words, her gaze locked with mine. "But I discovered a different path. I follow Jesus now." Her voice remained gentle, yet those words hung heavy in the air. My breath caught. Throughout my life I had been taught that Christians were lost souls, cursed and distant from truth. Hearing this woman, who had survived the crash and now sheltered under my roof, speak of abandoning Islam for Jesus shook me to my core. She spoke without anger or shame. She spoke with peace. I sat there staring, trying to comprehend how someone from a place like Jordan, raised as a Muslim, could have chosen such a bold departure. Her words echoed in my thoughts as I reflected on my own existence. That evening, after my children had fallen asleep, I sat beside her and for the first time in many years opened my heart. My voice quivered as I said, "My name is Amina. I am an imam's daughter. My father raised me on the Quran's teachings. He declared that women hold no value above men. Education was forbidden to me, as was entering the mosque. He claimed his words were Allah's words. I believed him." I paused, swallowing hard, but the words continued flowing. When I turned 16, he began instructing me about things, about marriage and duty that made no sense. But he insisted they represented Allah's will. From him I bore 6 children. "These are my children," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. "All from him, all hidden from the world." Sarah's eyes widened as she listened. She sat up slowly, wincing from the pain in her side, but her attention never wavered from me. Her lips parted as if to speak, but for a moment silence overwhelmed her. Then she shook her head slowly, disbelief and sorrow etched across her face. "Amina," she said, her voice breaking, "that is not God's way, that is not faith, that is abuse disguised as religion." Her words pierced through me. No one had ever named my life with that word, abuse. I had lived believing it was normal, that it was obedience, that it was my pathway to paradise. Yet hearing her speak it with such certainty made my heart tremble. She looked at me again, her voice growing stronger. "Your father corrupted the Quran's meaning. He twisted it for his own purposes. This is what men do when they crave power. They make themselves gods instead of serving God." Her shock gave me the courage to continue. For hours, I poured out the story I had kept locked inside for years. I described the house in Baghdad, my mother's death when I was 6, how my father moved us to the desert to isolate me completely. I explained how he prevented me from speaking with other girls, how he silenced me with his authority, and how every verse he quoted became another link in my chains. I described years of silence, constant fear, and nights filled with tears. I cried softly so my children wouldn't hear. Sarah listened to every word, never breaking eye contact. She placed her hand gently over mine and whispered, "You are brave, Amina, so incredibly brave. Many women endure this and never speak it aloud. You have carried so much alone." My chest tightened as tears streamed down my cheeks. No one had ever called me brave. When I finished, she leaned back, her face pale with grief and anger. She shook her head again, repeating softly, "This is not God's will." Then she moved closer and spoke firmly. "Amina, listen to me. Men have always misused sacred words in Islam, in other religions too. They select verses, they distort them, they forge chains for women. They tell us we are lesser, but it is not true." Her eyes glistened as she continued. "I know this because I lived it in Jordan. I too was told the same lies. I was told my only value was in service. I was told to remain silent, to cover myself, to obey every man's word. But my heart cried out inside me, the same way yours has. I understand the prison you describe because I lived in it too. But Amina, there is freedom. I found it when I encountered Jesus." The name Jesus wasn't foreign to me. My father had mentioned Isa in the Quran, describing him as a prophet, but Sarah spoke of him differently, not as a distant historical figure, but as someone alive, present, someone who granted her freedom. I frowned, confused, and asked softly, "How? How can Jesus bring freedom?" My question unlocked something within her. She straightened, her eyes alive with conviction, and began explaining in the simplest terms she could manage. "Jesus is not merely a prophet, Amina. He is God's son. He came to give life, to shatter chains. He loved women. He spoke with them when no one else would. He declared that women are not inferior. He gave them value when the world gave them shame. He died for us so we wouldn't carry guilt, so we could be free. In him, there is no slave, no master, only God's children." Her words disturbed me. They were unlike anything I had ever heard. In the mosque, the teachings focused on rules, punishments, and obedience. There was no gentleness, no sense of being loved. I whispered, almost fearfully, "But the Quran says women must obey men, that their place is beneath them." Sarah shook her head firmly. "That is what men told you, Amina. That is what your father forced you to believe. But Jesus says something different. He says, 'Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest.' He says, 'If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed.' These words are not chains, they are freedom." She paused, then added gently, "Your father claimed to be your Lord, but only God is Lord. And in Jesus you see who God truly is, a father who doesn't abuse but loves, heals, and restores." The room fell silent as her words settled within me. I stared at my hands, roughened from years of labor, trembling under the weight of my story. Could it be true? Could there be a God who saw me as more than a servant? Could Jesus, whom I had only known as a prophet, be the one offering freedom? Sarah's face remained calm, filled with a peace I had never witnessed before. She reached out and touched my arm. "Amina, I know you are afraid. I know your life has been filled with lies told in religion's name, but I want you to know this. You are not worthless. You are not forgotten. God sees you. He saw you the day you carried me from the desert. He sees you now, and through Jesus he calls you his daughter, not his slave." Her words burned in my heart like fire. I thought of the years of silence, of the 6 children I had borne in shame, of the nights when I lay awake wishing for an end. For the first time, I wondered if perhaps my life wasn't cursed, but waiting for something different. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks as I whispered, "But how do I know it's true?" Sarah's eyes softened. She retrieved the small Bible she carried in her bag and held it out to me. "This is God's word, Amina. I will show you verses in Arabic so you can read for yourself. Don't take only my words. Read his words. You will see the difference between chains and freedom." I took the book with trembling hands, feeling its weight as though it carried answers I had long searched for. That night, long after Sarah had fallen asleep, I sat by the dim light of a small lamp and opened the Bible. My eyes fell on the verse she had marked, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." My heart pounded as I read it again. No male or female, no higher or lower, all one. I thought of my father's words, the verses he used to silence me, the rules he built as chains. Then I looked at this verse, so simple, so clear, so unlike anything I had been taught. For the first time in my life, I saw words that gave me value, not shame. And in the silence of that desert night, I felt something awaken inside me, a spark of hope that had been buried for years now rising to life. On the 5th morning, Sarah told me she would be leaving soon. Her wounds had healed enough for movement without constant pain, and she explained that her fellow soldiers would come to retrieve her. My heart sank at her words. In those days with her, I had experienced something I had never known before, a friendship that carried no control, no chains, no fear. The thought of her departure filled me with emptiness, but she reassured me with a gentle touch on my hand. "Amina, I will return," she promised. "You saved me, and I will not forget you." Before she left, she pressed something into my palm, a small Arabic Bible, its cover worn but sturdy. She also left several folded American bills. "For the children," she said softly, "this will help, and this book will guide you." When the moment arrived, I stood at the doorway as Sarah was helped away by two soldiers who had arrived quietly, thanking me with deep bows of their heads. My children clung to my legs, watching silently, too young to understand the moment's weight. I felt both relief that she was safe and grief that she was leaving. As her figure disappeared into the horizon, I looked at the Bible in my hands and felt its weight like treasure. My fingers trembled as I traced the letters on the cover. I had never held such a book before. Quickly, I hid it beneath a loose wooden panel in the corner of our small room. My father hadn't yet returned from Iran, and I knew if he ever found it, he would burn it and perhaps punish me severely. The money I tucked into an old jar buried beneath clothes, saving it for food in secret. That night, after putting the children to sleep, I pulled out the Bible and opened it carefully. The first words I read in Arabic struck me with power. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." I read the sentence again and again, my mind struggling to grasp it, but my heart feeling its strength. It was different from the Quran, not written like commands or punishments, but like a story. I flipped through the pages Sarah had marked with small pieces of cloth. Each verse seemed to speak directly to me. I read Jesus' words saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." My eyes filled with tears. For years I had carried silence and pain. Could it be that God himself was calling me to rest? I whispered the words, clinging to them as if they were life itself. 2 days later, my father returned from Iran. He had traveled for religious duties and returned with gifts of dates and new prayer beads. He entered the house with his usual authority, his eyes sweeping over me and the children, checking that his rules had been maintained. He asked no questions about the days he had been away. To him, life continued as if nothing had changed. I forced myself to act as I always did, quiet, obedient, attentive to his needs. My heart raced with fear, knowing that hidden in the corner of the house was a book that could cost me my life. I prayed silently that he wouldn't notice the small changes in me, the way my heart beat faster when I looked at the Bible at night, the way hope had begun to stir inside me. He remained unaware, but my fear never left. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. Each day I went about my chores as always, cooking, cleaning, tending to the children. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside everything was different. Each night after my father had gone to sleep, I would pull out the Bible and read by the faint glow of a lamp. Sometimes I read only a few verses before exhaustion claimed me, but even those small moments filled me with strength I had never known. I read about Jesus speaking to the woman at the well, offering her living water. I read about him protecting a woman accused of sin, telling her accusers, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." These stories spoke to me like no Islamic teaching ever had. They told me I mattered, that I was seen, that my worth was not in silence but in God's love. Still, doubt wrestled inside me. I asked myself constantly if I was doing something dangerous, if I was betraying my faith, if I was inviting curses upon myself and my children. My father's voice echoed in my mind, his warnings about disobedience, his constant reminders that women were created to serve men and nothing more. The Quranic verses he used to silence me replayed in my memory like chains rattling. But then I would remember Sarah's face, her words about Jesus bringing freedom, her peace that shone even through her pain. I asked myself, could such peace be false? Could such freedom be a lie? Each night as I read, the doubts battled with the hope inside me, and though fear was strong, hope grew stronger still. I began to whisper prayers, not to Allah as my father had taught me, but to Jesus, asking him if he was truly listening. Months passed in this struggle. Sarah did not return, and with each day, my hope of seeing her again grew smaller. My children asked sometimes about the auntie who had stayed with us, but I only told them she had returned to her people. In my heart, I longed for her presence, her voice, her reassurance. At times, I felt abandoned, as if she had forgotten her promise. But when I opened the Bible, I found verses that gave me comfort. "I will never leave you nor forsake you," I read one night. And I wept, clutching the book to my chest. Perhaps Sarah was gone, but Jesus was not. Still, loneliness weighed heavily on me. I carried my secret like a hidden flame, protecting it from the winds of suspicion, yet fearing it would burn out without the breath of someone to guide me. There were days when despair almost won. On those days, I looked at my children and wondered what future awaited them. Would my daughters grow up in the same silence I had known? Would my sons learn to repeat the same authority their grandfather had forced on me? The thought crushed me, and I cried silently into my pillow at night. But then I would open the Bible and read words that lifted me again. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. The promise of freedom echoed in my heart, reminding me that what I lived now didn't have to be the end. I clung to those words, repeating them like a prayer each morning before I faced another day of silence. Slowly, I began to believe that change was possible, even if I couldn't yet see how it would come. The waiting became a test of faith I had never known before. My father remained in control. My children grew under his shadow, and the desert life continued without change. But in the hidden hours of the night, a new world opened to me. Through the Bible's pages, I began to memorize verses, whispering them to myself when fear threatened to choke me. I hid the book carefully each morning, terrified it would be discovered, but also knowing I couldn't live without it anymore. The money Sarah left remained untouched, waiting for a day I didn't yet understand. I told myself that if she never returned, I would still carry the gift she had given me. For the first time in my life, I knew that I was not completely alone. Even in the silence, I had a voice speaking to me through every page, telling me I was loved. 8 months passed since Sarah left my home, and I had nearly lost hope of ever seeing her again. Then one night, when the children were already asleep and my father was at the mosque in town for imam duties, I heard a soft knock at the back of the house. My heart froze. No one ever came that way. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to open the door quietly. There she was, Sarah dressed in plain Iraqi clothes, her head covered, her face partly hidden. My eyes filled with tears. She had come back. She stepped quickly inside and closed the door behind her. 2 men waited in the distance, their figures blending into the darkness. She explained in a whisper that they were part of her team, disguised and working quietly to avoid attention. My heart pounded as she pulled me close and said, "Tonight is the night. We will take you and the children to Jordan." At first, I couldn't believe her words. I had dreamed of escape, but dreams had always felt impossible in the grip of my father's control. Now, suddenly, freedom stood at my door. I rushed to wake my children, my hands trembling as I told them we were leaving. They were frightened, confused, but they obeyed. We gathered nothing but the clothes on our backs and a small bag with the money she had once left me. My father was asleep in another part of the house, unaware that his grip on us was ending forever. We moved silently through the desert night. Sarah held one of my younger children in her arms, and I carried another, while the older ones clung to my sides. The 2 men guided us swiftly, keeping us low and moving us along narrow paths where no one would see us. My heart raced with every step, fearing my father might wake and discover our absence. But the night was silent, the stars wide above us, as though the heavens themselves were watching. After hours of walking, we reached a vehicle hidden behind rocks. Sarah helped us inside, and we drove through the darkness, away from the life that had trapped us for so long. I held my children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks, the Bible pressed close to my chest under my clothes. I felt chains breaking, though I still trembled with fear until we crossed the border into Jordan. When Sarah finally told me, "You are safe now, Amina," I broke down in tears. We had entered Jordan under cover of night with papers and arrangements I didn't understand but trusted. Her team worked quietly, speaking little, moving us through checkpoints I never thought we could pass. By dawn, we were in a small house on the outskirts of Amman where I felt the weight of freedom for the first time. The air was different, no longer heavy with fear, it felt alive with promise. My children slept in a pile on the floor, exhausted from the journey, while I sat with Sarah in silence, unable to stop crying. For years I had been a prisoner in my own home. Now, in a single night, I had crossed into a new life. I whispered again and again, "Thank you, Jesus," believing with all my heart that this was his answer to my prayers. The first weeks in Jordan were filled with adjustment. We were given a small apartment, nothing luxurious, but to me it was a palace. I could step outside without fear, walk with my children in the street, and speak to neighbors without worrying about my father's shadow. Sarah visited often, at first guiding me through the changes, helping me understand the city, teaching me how to live in freedom. She enrolled me in classes for basic education, something I had never been allowed to touch in Iraq. Sitting in a classroom for the first time at nearly 30 years old felt overwhelming. I held a pencil with trembling hands, learning letters and numbers like a child. At times I felt ashamed, but then I remembered the years stolen from me. Each word I wrote, each sentence I read was a victory over the silence I had lived under for so long. My children adjusted quickly, their laughter filling our small apartment for the first time. They went to school carrying books and wearing uniforms. Watching them walk into a classroom filled me with joy I couldn't describe. They were no longer trapped in the cycle of control and silence. They were free to learn, to grow, to dream. I worked hard to support them, taking jobs as a cleaner at first, then later as an assistant in a small shop. It wasn't easy, but every coin I earned felt like a step toward independence. With Sarah's help, I managed to save enough to provide for food and clothes. She became like a sister to me, checking on us, encouraging me, and reminding me that Jesus was the one who had opened the door for this new life. Each day I felt stronger, more certain that I had stepped into a future worth living. Faith became the center of my new life. No longer did I hide the Bible under wooden boards. I placed it on a shelf in our apartment, open for my children to see and read. Each night we gathered together and read passages in Arabic, slowly understanding more of Jesus' words. We prayed openly without fear of being silenced. My children asked questions, their young minds curious, and I guided them with the little knowledge I had, reminding them always that God loved them and saw them as precious. On Sundays, we joined a small group of believers in Amman, many of them former Muslims like me, who had found freedom in Christ. Their testimonies gave me strength, reminding me I wasn't alone. We sang songs together, prayed together, and shared meals, building a family that was bound not by blood, but by faith. As I grew in my faith, I also grew in confidence. I began to share parts of my story with others in the group, though never with full detail. At first, the pain was still raw, and the memories of my father's control still haunted me. But slowly, I found healing in speaking out loud. Others encouraged me, telling me my journey was a testimony of God's power to bring light out of darkness. I began to believe it. No longer was I the silent girl forced into submission. I was now a woman standing in freedom, raising her children in love and truth. Each time I looked at them, I promised myself they would never live the life I had endured. They would know education, faith, and freedom. They would grow up with hope, not fear. Looking back on my journey, I see clearly God's hand in every step. From the day Sarah's helicopter crashed in the desert to the moment she returned, disguised to rescue us, every detail was a piece of a plan greater than I could have imagined. I had been born into bondage, raised in silence, and trapped in a life that stole my voice. But now, in Jordan, I live with hope. My children laugh freely. I walk openly, and I no longer bow to fear. The words of Jesus that once felt like whispers now feel like a foundation under my feet. So if the sun sets you free, you will be free indeed. That verse has become the song of my life. I was once silent, unseen, forgotten. Now I am free, seen, and alive in Him. My story is not one of despair, but of new life. My beloved brothers and sisters in Islam, I want you to understand that my story is not only about me. I am safe now, living in Jordan with my children. But there are countless other girls and women who are still living the life I once knew. They are hidden in homes, silenced in villages, trapped in fear under fathers, husbands, or brothers who use religion as a weapon. These girls cannot speak for themselves. They cannot ask for help. Many of them believe their suffering is Allah's will, because they have been told nothing else since childhood. They are convinced that silence is holy, that abuse is duty, that pain is honor. I know because for years I believed the same lies. My freedom today doesn't erase their chains. That is why I speak now, not only for myself, but for them. I ask you to pray for these girls. Pray for those who are beaten down by verses twisted and misused. Pray for the young ones who are denied education, whose voices are silenced before they can grow. Pray for those who lie awake at night, afraid of the man in the next room, afraid to cry out because no one will listen. Pray that they will feel the presence of Jesus even in their darkness, the same way I did when I whispered His name for the first time. Prayer may seem small, but it is greater than chains. It reaches places no soldiers, no aid workers, no journalists can ever reach. I am proof of this. My freedom came because God heard my cries, even when I was too broken to believe He would. I also ask you to share my story. Speak about it to your friends, your family, your community. Let people know that in many Islamic countries, what happens inside homes never makes it to the media. The world may hear about wars, politics, or treaties, but not about the little girls locked away, the women forced into silence, the mothers raising children in fear. These stories are buried, but they are real. When you share my testimony, you give voice to those who cannot speak. You make it harder for the silence to remain hidden. You shine light on what others want to keep in the dark. The more people know, the harder it will be for the suffering to continue unseen. Don't think that what you do is too small. Every prayer, every word, every story shared has power. When Sarah sat in my home and told me about Jesus, she didn't know if her words would change my life, but they did. When she gave me the Bible in Arabic, she didn't know if I would read it or hide it forever. But I read it, and it gave me hope. When she returned for me months later, she risked her own safety for my freedom. Each step mattered. You may never see the results of your prayer or your voice, but God will use it. Somewhere, a girl like me will feel hope for the first time because of what you did. I know some of you listening to this may wonder how you can help beyond prayer and sharing. The answer is simple. Don't turn your eyes away. Don't believe the lie that silence is too far away to matter. Remember that these are real people with real names, real faces, and real pain. They are daughters, sisters, and mothers. They are precious to God. He sees them even when the world doesn't. He loves them even when they are told they are worthless. I ask you to carry their stories in your heart. When you sit at your table with your daughters, think of those who cannot laugh freely. When you see your sons running free, think of those growing up to repeat the cycle of control. Let their hidden cries move you to compassion and action. As I end this story, I don't end with sorrow. I end with hope, because I have seen what God can do. He took a woman like me, voiceless and broken, and gave me a new life. He took children born in silence and gave them a future of freedom. He turned fear into faith, chains into wings, and I believe He can do the same for many others. That is why I share these words with you. My prayer is that you will not only remember my name, Amina, but also remember the countless names you may never hear. Pray for them, speak for them, share the story so that the silence will not remain. I once thought I would die in the desert, unknown and forgotten. But today I live to tell you that Jesus is alive and His love is greater than fear. He set me free and He will set many more free. Join me in this mission. Pray, speak, and act so that no more daughters will grow up believing their pain is holy, but instead will know the truth that sets them free. Let my story travel beyond me. Let it reach the ears that need to hear. And may the world know that even in the darkest places, hope still lives, because Christ still saves.